James O'Brien.
It is 4 minutes after 11. I'm now inevitably being bombarded with all the statistical evidence of the efficacy of face masks in stopping the spread of various conditions, not just COVID. But we've parked that particular Pantechnicon for now because Mick Lynch is in the studio. I don't know what you expect me to do when you tell me in my ear that we're on Global Player now, which means you can see us as well as hear us. What do you expect me to do? Brush my hair? Wax my beard or something? I don't change. Nothing changes. I just get very occasionally self-conscious. But Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT, and I think it's fair to say that one of the most... we're seeing you in more studios in the last few weeks than almost anybody else in the country. Where are we in percentage terms? Where is the industrial action? If we had a swingometer like Peter Snow used to have on election night, how do you feel it's going?
Well, it's going in a way that we don't want. We're having to take more industrial action. We don't want to take action. You know, I've been on a picket line this morning out in the rain and the cold. I don't expect people to be sympathetic to that. I understand the frustration and the anger that people have about not getting the services that they want and they pay for. But we are locked in. We've got a government that won't come to a practicable solution. There are solutions there that we discuss with the employers. But I keep repeating this in every studio, that the government are blocking a sensible negotiation that could get us to a compromise deal. And I think that's part of an ideological approach that we're hearing about bottomless pits of no money and all the rest of it. And that stops us getting a deal. We could have got a deal at the start of this process, and we're now into our fourth year. Many of our people haven't had a pay rise. And one of the more important issues for our members is the conditions that they have to work under. They're being threatened and ripped up. So we're locked in. I hope we don't get locked in. They've said to us they want to meet us next Monday. They waited until this Monday night when they had plenty of opportunity, 7 weeks, I think, since we gave notice of this action, to get a meeting on. But they waited until Tuesday morning when the action was on to go on the airwaves and say, get off the picket line and come to the talks. I would have come to the talks yesterday at 9 o'clock if they'd wanted to meet me. But there's a bit of grandstanding and a lot of argument going on in Whitehall between various departments. And it's obvious that the Treasury is dictating the show, whether it's the health service. The teachers will be coming into a mass dispute, I think, this month. And on the railway. And unfortunately for us, we're the first wave. And unfortunately for your listeners and viewers, they have to put up with me a lot. But that's not where we want to be. We want to get a solution and get out of this dispute.
I'll run through some of the stuff that Mark Harper said yesterday in a moment with you. I should remind people listening, the phone lines are open. 0345 606 0973 is the number you need. Mick's with us till 11 o'clock, so we should have time to rattle through a significant number of questions. But just out of curiosity, what are the lines of communication? What would have happened on Monday night or Sunday night? Would your mobile phone ring and someone would say, I've got Mark Harper for you on line one? Or?
Well, I got an email from somebody's secretary in Whitehall, from Hugh Merriman's secretary, the railway minister, saying, can you give us your availability for the 9th and 10th? Right. Which is obviously next week.
And that was the first you'd heard from them since the last industrial, or before?
Since the 15th of December. We had a short meeting on the 15th of December ahead of this phase of action, and we expected then to go into intense talks. We heard nothing since. But the lines of communication are there. I can speak to my counterparts in the companies at any time, and we frequently do keep in touch with each other just to check in. But they need a mandate, and I keep saying this. The Secretary of State has got contracts with the train operating companies that says he is responsible for all of their industrial strategy, their negotiating mandate, and indeed, if they want to write to me, they have to get approval directly from the Secretary of State, even to sign a letter. So he's in complete charge of the dispute, and he could either make it or break it. And at the moment, it appears that he's making a lot of warm words, and I welcome that. It's better than we had under Grant Shapps, which is just bellicose attacks. So I want to get on with Mark Harper and Hugh Merriman. I know that I can work with them. If they're allowed to work with us by the Treasury, and in turn they can allow the executives in the industry to negotiate with our people, and we can work up a deal. That's what I want. That's what our members want.
Just talk us through the explanation you offered yesterday on Good Morning Britain as to how subsidies mean that the rail companies aren't suffering any financial loss in the current climate? Because in a way, it's hard to square that with what you've just said. Obviously, they can't sustain this position indefinitely, but their sense of urgency is surely going to be compromised or diminished because the shareholders are still getting serviced.
Yeah, so part of these contracts that I just mentioned, where the Secretary of State is responsible for everything they do on the railway, they have to comply with his instructions, and if they do that, they're indemnified from any loss. That's why I'll sit across the room, as close as we are now, talking to senior executives from First Group and Abellio, and say, well, if you make this move on this issue, we'll try and come towards you, and we'd like you to do X, Y and Z on pay and what have you. They say, OK, we've got that down. We'll go off and check. And when it takes 3 or 4 weeks to get an answer, and then they say there's no movement. So that's the mandate. And if they do that, if they comply with that, they will be indemnified from any losses in this dispute. And that's a really weird situation. If I went into dispute with a private railway company, such as Eurostar, which I used to work for 2 decades or more, where we've done a pay deal at 8-point-something% this year, they have to take that loss. If they lose their business because of a strike day, they take that loss. And we've just done a deal at Eurostar for a subcontractor called Mighty, who didn't get a pay deal. We got a 10% pay award there after 2 years of no pay awards. So that company has to take the losses or front up against us. That's the way industrial disputes work. And if you were making washing machines or sofas, that's what you'd have to do as an MD. The MD of First Group on the railway does not have that jeopardy. When we go on strike, they don't lose any money. And in fact, last year they were given, during this dispute, they've been given £320 million of taxpayer and fair payers' money to run this dispute against us, and they have not lost a penny. In fact, they have made profit on every day the trains have been stopped. They also made profit on every day of the pandemic, when there were virtually no passengers and no revenue, but we were running the trains for the key workers, as they were called.
Is that the same mechanism?
Yes, they are completely indemnified.
So they're guaranteed a certain income regardless of whether anyone gets on a train or not?
The Secretary of State stepped in and said, the franchises said, we cannot run the railway on this basis, we have no revenue.
Right.
That's fair enough, that's completely true. You can't run a full railway service, so they clipped the railway service down to 60%, kept it going at peak times, encouraged people not to travel, but they were paid all of their revenue during the pandemic, as they are getting paid during the strikes. And that's a corrupt basis, I think, for any dispute to be run on.
If we were to see it through a lens of logic rather than politics, it would be because the alternative would be for them to just give back the keys.
Yeah, and that's what they've said. They've said to the government during the pandemic, we don't want to run the railways because there's no profit in it. When they were franchises, they at least had the pretense that they could run a business autonomously within certain parameters and make a surplus, and they put some reputation and a modicum of capital at risk. At the moment, you've got businesses that put no capital at risk, which is the justification for profit normally, and they've got no reputational risk because it all comes back to Mark Harper.
Well, let's talk about what he said yesterday. We'll work through these one by one. There is a very fair pay offer on the table, which has been accepted by 2 of the trade unions on Network Rail.
Well, the 2 trade unions that accepted are minuscule, and they're not affected by the changes. So you've got a white-collar union, the TSSA, who are supervising our people that are out there doing the shifts in general. They're not affected by the changes, and they've decided to accept it. That's fair enough. But they're tiny. Unite on the railway if they've got 100 members out of 40,000 Unite Network Rail workers, that's probably a good estimate. And they're not affected. They're office-based. Our members are out on the track, running the stations, repairing the rails, putting up the overhead line and all the rest of it. And they are profoundly affected by the changes that they want to make. So we have not accepted it because of the conditions. The pay offer is not very exciting either. We haven't had a pay rise in Network Rail for 4 years now, and it's way below the rate of inflation. But most of our members are agitated by the conditions. If we don't accept the conditions, we don't get a pay deal. If we don't accept the conditions, we won't get a job security deal, and our members will be made compulsorily redundant. So we've got a gun to our temple in that sense.
And a lot of the things that your members are concerned about wouldn't apply to members of Unite or TSSA.
No.
So, OK, well, let's talk about your members, because Mark Harper went on yesterday. The RMT recommended that their members didn't accept it, but actually a third of their members still voted in favour of it.
Well, a third of the members of the country voted for the Labour Party. They're not the government. Another way of putting that is on an 83% turnout, on an electronic ballot. 83% of our Network Rail members voted on that. They were given all of the documents, which run to 25 or 30 pages, all of the conditions and all of the offer document itself. They voted 64% to turn it down.
So just because I needed this clarifying. 2/3 voted in favour.
In favour of rejecting. 2/3
in favour of
voted
rejecting it,
against
and
the
a
deal.
third. So
Yeah,
he's
during
suggesting
that
that
period,
a 2-1 loss.
Yeah, 2-1 loss would be something that
Okay.
many football teams would be very happy with.
Yeah.
If you win by that margin, it's a win. But Network Rail also mounted a massive propaganda campaign within the company, films being made, compulsory briefings for staff, telling them how good a deal it was, and they lost that vote. We won the vote and Network Rail lost it.
Okay, and here's the bit that many people, regardless of their sympathies, struggle with. You said yesterday on a picket line at Euston, and you've reiterated it this morning, we would like to get into a situation where we're negotiating constantly with the companies and where we didn't have to have strike action and then work up a settlement that our members could vote on and accept. And Mark Harper said yesterday, I think it's time that the RMT got off the picket line and around the negotiating table to try and hammer out a deal with the train operating companies and Network Rail. It is a fair and reasonable offer on the table. You know, an ordinary punter listening to this is going to be completely baffled as to what's going on.
I'm not surprised. I'm willing to go there. I said yesterday morning I'll go to his office right now and come off that picket line. So we gave
But hang on.
notice.
So there's something there, isn't there? Because he's saying you should be negotiating with the train operating companies and Network Rail, and you're saying, well, there's not much point doing that in good faith because they're taking all their orders from you anyway.
And he's convened
So you
a
want to talk to him?
I do want to talk to him, and I'll be talking to his rail minister next Monday in the presence of the companies, the two sets of companies. But let's not forget, James, we gave 3 weeks' notice before this action. The reason we put this action on was Network Rail are now imposing their changes without our agreement. They never asked us into any talks, serious talks, and they didn't even ask us to take the strikes off to allow for those talks. We've never had a request from the companies to suspend the action so that we could go into serious talks, and they haven't done that now. He chose to wait till Monday night after office hours to say, are you available in a week's time, which is after the strikes have finished, and so that he could get on a media blitz on Tuesday morning and say we should get off the picket lines. If he'd have asked us last week during the Christmas break, we would have come and met him any time, night or day. He didn't want to do that.
And a line from the op-ed in Rupert Murdoch's Times newspaper this morning. Mr. Lynch, with far-left sympathies, sees industrial action as part of a broader movement to undermine the capitalist system.
Completely untrue. I'm a pragmatist. I'm from a socialist background. Sort of things I want, traditional Labour values. I'd like to see a decent Labour government that builds houses and has public ownership. I'm not a communist. I'm not even affiliated to an ideology. The way the governments change usually is through the ballot box.
You're not affiliated to the Labour Party either, are you?
No, I'm not a member of the Labour Party or any other political party. And I'm not joining one. The way that governments change is through the electorate voting them out. We've had a bit of difference on that this year because it's the Monday Club that votes governments in and out. But I'd like to see a general election, and I want to see a new Prime Minister. But that's not what this dispute about. This dispute is about changes that they want to make in our industry and undervaluing of our members' labour. We'd like a pay rise and a decent set of conditions. And this government can stay where it is, and they'll be accountable to the people of Britain.
You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, joined for the duration of this hour by Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT Union, and he will be taking your calls directly after this.
Mick Lynch, the leader of James O'Brien on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
20 minutes after 11 is the time. Before we hit the phones with Mick Lynch, General Secretary of the RMT, this is from Simon. James, you're letting him off lightly. Grow a pair. Ask him how much he earns and how much the rail staff earn. Come on, let's compare them with normal working class people. So, Mick Lynch, for the 500th time since this industrial action started, talk us through the remuneration packages that you and your members enjoy.
Yeah, so my salary, as voted for by my members at the AGM, is £84,000. That's what my basic salary is. Our members involved in these two disputes, train operating companies, 3/4 of them earn less than £32,000. And in Network Rail, it's about 2/3 of them earn less than £32,000. There are people in this dispute that are earning £18,000 as a salary, station staff, basic grade. And there are some very highly qualified signallers, for instance, working on high-speed lines, the highest grade people, that will be on a salary of about £50,000. But that's a minority. The vast chunk of our members are sitting between 25 and 35,000 for shift work 7 days a week. Modest salaries. They're not the worst paid people.
Being available 7 days a week. They're not
Yeah.
seven shifts
Well, they
a week.
tend to have rosters that go
Sure.
around 7 days, 5 on and 2 off, and whatever the shift is. And that's night shifts, late shifts, morning shifts and whatever. So they're moderately paid. Some people are well paid and some people are quite low paid.
I hope that helps, Simon. Perhaps you should grow a pair of ears, because I asked Mick Lynch that question last time he was here. Tony's in Loughton to kick things off. Tony, what would you like to ask Mick Lynch?
Good morning, Mr. Lynch. Good morning.
Morning.
Tony from Loughton, once of the Stabby Talk. Yes, I mean, it's well known that we have some of the, some very draconian trade union laws. Some call it anti-trade union laws. I wanted to ask your opinion on the bill that's making its way through Parliament at the moment, which requires minimum service levels on the railway when there's industrial action, which will compel union members to actually cross their own picket lines and provide a service, by doing so infringing on their civil rights to withdraw their labour from the workplace. What's your view on that, Bill? What do you think the reaction of the wider trade union movement, including your trade union union, should be going forward to fight this outrageous legislation? Thank you.
Well, there's a couple of things, Tony. The laws are designed to break strikes. We've got lawful ballots that we have to go through, which we call the anti-trade union laws. We have to get 50% of our people voting, and of that, at least 40% have to vote yes. We've smashed those thresholds, as have many unions. So having lost that argument with the new set of legislation that came in recently, Grant Shapps was saying that he was going to conscript agency workers to go into work. They were going to make us put every offer, so the employer could offer 3.5 one day and 3.6 the next day, and we'd have to put it to a referendum of all our members, which would tie us in knots. And now they're saying that they just want to ban strikes by having these minimum services. So, for instance, if I wanted to run a signalling system, I'd have to get all the signallers to work, even if only 50% of the trains were running, in order to provide a system up to the north of Scotland and down to the west of Cornwall and whatever. So basically you're talking about the conscription of labour, even during a lawful dispute. And I would have to name my members that went to work to break our own picket lines, and that's unacceptable in a free society. We're always being told that repressive regimes do things against the public. And, of course, the mark of what went on in Poland and what goes on in China and probably Russia and other repressive regimes is that the trade unions aren't free. And what the trade unions are doing at the minute is campaigning against poverty and campaigning against oppressive work practices. So we want the ability to do that. What we're going to do is join up with the other unions, as you'd expect, to campaign against that in Parliament, which is what is right. We're hoping the Labour Party will oppose these things, and Keir Starmer has said he has. So we'll use all the constitutional means in the Commons and in the Lords. I'm hoping,
and in the courts.
And in the court, that will come. So, and we don't know what the courts will say until we've seen the details.
Which is likely to be this month. These are the extra anti-strike laws being prepared by.
We believe it's against the International Labour Convention, which has nothing to do with the European Court. That goes way back to the 30s and 40s. It's an international body in Switzerland that the whole world is signed up to, minimum standards. So the right to strike is a fundamental human right. If you're not able to do that, the employer and the government can dictate to you what you do as a previously free individual. That's not acceptable. So I think all Democrats and people of goodwill should be opposed to the trade unions being corralled in this way, because the government is losing the argument on pay and working practices.
Well, I often see, I don't know what the numbers were yesterday or today for sure, but I often see figures like 1 in 5 services were still running on a strike day, and that this legislation would mean that 20% of regular rail services would need to continue.
Well, they haven't put a figure on it yet. That would be dictated by the Secretary of State for the service. So the Secretary of State can make a decision.
But if it was 20%, would the number matter? Would it dilute the principle at all?
Well, then it would stop the management having to do it. At the minute, management run those services.
Right.
And people who are not on strike. So drivers aren't on strike today, but the signallers are.
I see.
So they
it would
would
be
use
compelling your members. How do we think that might work, Mick Lynch? Just imagine for me. I know it's not your idea, but you have to have given more thought than the average punter to how it would actually work, because it is, you have someone who wants to be on strike and is being ordered to work. So what would happen next?
They're saying that we'd have to reach an agreement, which would be really strange. You have a strike against the company, you have to reach an agreement with that company to determine how many services would run. And if that can't be done, the Secretary of State for whether it's the health service or transport or whatever would decide that. And then we would have to name the people, we understand it, that would go in and provide that service. And if they don't do it, we can be sequestrated or brought before the court. And it could be possible that the individual worker would be prosecuted or sacked for not turning up for that shift. And ultimately, the Secretary of State may be able to name the people or the company on behalf of the Secretary of State. So these are real interferences in people's individual rights, not just trade union rights, but you as an individual decide, I'm going to withhold my labour, which you're still free to do without a trade union, by the way. They would say, well, you've got to come to work. That is conscription.
So what would happen if a non-union member took individual industrial action?
Well, we don't know. This is what we've got to see in the legislation.
Sorry, I was just thinking
and
about
there are loads of complications about how that would work. It may lead to more unofficial disputes, of course, because the trade union wouldn't be involved.
Thank you, Tony. Jacob's in Hitchin. Jacob, what would you like to say?
Hi. I just wondered, with the amount of time that this has been going on now, and obviously the effect that it's going to be having on staff's wages, I just wonder how you're planning to kind of maintain the level of industrial action and making sure that it isn't going to be you guys that blink first.
Yeah, well, our members do sacrifice their wages. They don't get paid whenever they're not at work. And we've had an overtime ban lately, and that's affected earnings quite drastically. What we do is we collect money. We have a hardship fund. We don't pay strike pay. There's not a per day payment from the union. People apply if they've got financial hardship, and we support people where we can. And that's money collected from ourselves and from people, the public send us money as well. So that's payouts that we can give. We have not been that forceful in this dispute. We didn't have a strike between October and December to allow for talks, and there weren't really any. And over the 6-7 months as it is now, I think we've taken 16 days, or will have taken 16 days on the TOCs and 19, I think, on Network Rail, usually simultaneously. So we have been spreading it out to try and allow for that, our members to get some respite and for the public to get respite. Unfortunately, when we're not on strike, the railway companies cannot run the service either. And they if you go to a mainline station, they'll say, trains aren't running today due to staff shortages. When I go into talks, they tell me they want to make a few thousand people redundant. So somehow that's not working. And it doesn't add up.
That's not entirely, it might be a bit disingenuous, because the shortages that prevent the trains from running may be different from the redundancies.
Well, it's overtime.
Introduced, yes.
So we've got a system that's running on overtime and always has done, even under BR. Vast amounts of overtime are worked. But at the same time, they've issued a statutory redundancy notices on Network Rail for over 2,000 people. Now, that will get trimmed down through negotiations, but they're saying that there are too many staff on the railway. At the same time, they're saying, can you all please work overtime? Grant Shapps said he was going to ban overtime on the railway. All the railway executives were either laughing up their sleeves or crying in fright. They said, well, how will we run the railway? Because we've never had enough people to run it. We've always relied on overtime, and overtime is cheaper than employing people.
Is it indefinitely sustainable if you spread it out in the way that you're doing? Presumably this is part of the process of planning industrial action. You can't say, right, but down tools for a month, because people would go bankrupt, they'd lose their homes. So can you keep this up forever?
Well, we'll keep it up as long as our members want to. They voted twice for this action.
If they want to keep it up forever, can you? I mean,
if our members want to sustain it.
I see. So when members reach the point of financial jeopardy, that might be when they start voting against.
We'll get resolutions from branches, and we have to revalidate our ballot every 6 months, which we've done on 2 occasions. So if our members don't want to carry on, or they want to accept the deal, we will put that to a referendum. The one we've had so far, they've rejected on a mass basis. The other one we can't put to them because it's completely opposed to our policy on driver-only operation. So I've told the companies what they need to do. Our members understand that there's going to be compromise, and if we can get reasonable proposals, we can move towards a solution.
It's 11:31. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, joined for another half an hour by Mick Lynch. If you want to put a question to the General Secretary of the RMT, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. Meanwhile, Holly Harris is here with your headlines.
The General Secretary of the RMT says the government is blocking the sensible negotiation that could lead to a deal and avoid more rail strikes. Mick Lynch has told James ministers have been guilty of grandstanding during the dispute. 2 men charged with the murder of a footballer on a nightclub dance floor in Birmingham are set to stand trial in July. Cody Fisher was stabbed at the Crane in Digbeth on Boxing Day. A group representing medics is calling for an emergency meeting with Rishi Sunak about the NHS. The Doctors Association UK has written an open letter to the Prime Minister asking for Parliament to be recalled early over concerns the health service is under intolerable pressure. The weather, showery rain across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England. Mostly dry elsewhere, windy but feeling mild, a maximum temperature of 14 Celsius.
Mick Lynch, the leader of the RMT, takes your calls on
Week free.
James O'Brien on LBC.
26 minutes to 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. More of your calls to the General Secretary of the RMT, Mick Lynch, although obviously I reserve the right at any moment, any juncture, to dive in with my own questions. Petrus is in Ramsgate. Petrus, what would you like to say?
Hi there, morning both. Yeah, Mick, I wonder if we could ask, taking into account how important public opinion is at the moment with strikes across the board, how a union leader such as yourself would go about making decisions for the timing of strikes. So, for example, why you wouldn't sort of front load a strike for a block of a week or, dare I say, even a month. And I know you have to balance, obviously, ethical decisions there, but how do you come to that decision, trying to keep public opinion going, but also having a high impact at the same time?
Yeah, so we want our action to be effective. I mean, it's our members' money and it's our members' commitment, and we are aware of the public. I mean, we are the public. All our members have got partners and families and a community they live in, so we don't want to just wind people up for the sake of it. And so we look at what the needs of the day are, how the dispute is faring, what the negotiation position is, what the offers are. And, for instance, when the Queen passed away, we postponed our action, and the British Legion contacted me and said, look, can you cut us a break on the big collection day? So we did that. But there's a day every day of the week is some public event or some campaigning event. So we wouldn't have any time to do that. People criticised us about Christmas. We tried to keep away from that, but then Network Rail decided to impose the changes commencing at the Christmas period. So that's why the action came about then. So we are conscious of what the public thinks, and nobody wants to alienate your fellow citizens. You know, there's no point in doing that. But unfortunately, industrial action has to have some effect. So what we'll do next week, and we're coming to the end of this phase on Saturday, we'll get reports in from all our reps across the country and our officers, you know, from Scotland and north of England, Wales and down south, and we'll look at how the members feel. We will have these meetings with the companies and the government, and we'll reflect on that, whether we need to give everybody a break, including the public and our members a break, and give time for some negotiations. And our ambition is to get a negotiated settlement. It's not, despite what the Daily Mail and everybody else will tell you, just to have strikes for the sake of it. Because our people have got to go down to Asda's and fill their baskets full of shopping and hopefully have an enjoyable life. And we understand that about the hospitality industry and our fellow workers who want to go about their lives in a normal way. So we're careful about what we do, but we cannot avoid inconvenience if we're to have effective action.
Where do you derive the idea that the public opinion is still behind you from? I think the most recent poll I can find, it's in the Times today, YouGov from December 16th to 19th, has support at 43% and opposition at 49%.
Yeah, I mean, in this phase of action, I don't think that's unreasonable, James, to be honest with you.
So you don't enjoy public support?
Well, I think we've got a level of public support that surprised most people, including the commentators in the media and the politicians in this country. So that's above normal levels of support for an inconvenient dispute. I think we can rebuild that when we show how reasonable we are and how willing we are to go the extra mile to get a settlement to this dispute. And our ambition is not to alienate our fellow citizens, as I've said. I think everyone's been surprised by the level of support that most people in these disputes are getting. But it's hard to maintain that. I take that, and I take no pleasure in people being frustrated in their daily lives.
How conscious are your members of that? How closely do they watch public opinion?
Well, our members are obviously out there. They're at Euston, you know, pictures I've seen at Euston Station this morning, all around this country today. Our members are on picket lines. People come up to them. Sometimes you get a little bit of hostility. Car horns are being beeped. People are bringing biscuits and coffees and making donations to picket funds and strike funds. So we get a good level of support, not just from trade unions. We also get support when we're back at work from the travelling public, who are just as alienated about their fares and the services they're getting for the money they're paying. So it's a balance, and we want to maintain that balance, and we'd like people to support us and understand why we're doing this, and also that we're doing it in some ways for other workers and other people who are facing pressure in this society. You
mentioned that, and in fact the same YouGov poll has support for nurses at 66%, ambulance staff at 63%, firefighters at 58%, teachers at 50%, postal workers at 49%, and bus workers at 46%, all majorities, if you like, of support rather than opposition, which I think, thank you Petrus, I think takes us neatly to Maxine in Leeds.
My support is better than the Network Rail ballot though, isn't it?
Yes.
Which they were claiming as a victory, the right-wing media.
Yeah, well, you make a point. So when Mark Harper says, not just the right-wing media, it was the Secretary of State for Transport saying that a third of your members voted against it. Here you have 43% of the public casting their vote in support of your industrial action. So it's a valid comparison. That
and
you
less than half of the public are against us, which wouldn't be valid in an industrial relations ballot, funnily enough.
No, another valid point. Maxine in Leeds, what would you like to ask Mick Lynch?
Hiya, Mick. Nice to speak to you.
Hi,
my question is, as we see more and more professions and industries voting to take industrial action, and obviously more industrial action, the BMA, the teachers coming this year, do you think that it would be a general strike would be the only thing that would see real change happen in this country?
Not the first. Quite a few people asking about the possibility of a general strike. And I should actually refer back to that op-ed in the Times newspaper today, which says, well, I'll read it, because this is, you refer to the right-wing media, this is essentially what you're talking about. He has come close to supporting proposals for a general strike, and there are clear attempts to coordinate action with other unions to achieve maximum disruption. Such collusion is not illegal, although the Thatcher government outlawed secondary picketing a generation ago. Little wonder that the government is now considering laws to force unions to guarantee minimum service during strikes.
Yeah, well, that's what I expect these op-eds to say. I mean, unions would be daft if they didn't try to maximise and synchronise their action. Much of these disputes are about public sector pay and public services in general. So if you are running the education service, if you're running the health service and other important providers, the government is at the heart of all of that. It's about choices about funding for public services, and that includes public sector workers' pay. So I don't think we'll get a general strike as we understood it in 1926, all out, the TUC just calls it. It's very difficult to synchronise that and stay within the law, and each dispute has got to stand alone on its own merits and under the legal scrutiny. But once you've got a mandate, you can synchronise what you do in order to have the maximum effect. Now, the government is the employer of many of these people directly and in a second-hand way in terms of funding for public sector providers. So it would be useful if the trade union movement coordinated what it's doing, because we've got the same issues.
You are coordinating a bit. It's not a coincidence that ASLEF are coming out tomorrow, is it? Or today?
Well, we named our action, and ASLEF named their action independently of us. We didn't consult us. I'm not. That's absolutely true.
Well, it's complete coincidence, is it, that it happens smack in the middle?
I don't know what ASLEF's thinking was, but it didn't consult me. I know Mick Lynch very well. He's a friend of mine, but he didn't phone me up and say, you do this and we'll do that. Not at all, no.
But it is okay, so it's
I'd imagine
coordinated,
they've looked at what
but
we're
it wasn't.
doing. Yeah, I imagine they looked at what we're doing and decided to get involved.
You mentioned the TUC. They have warned about the potential impacts of the so-called retained EU law bill, which is, as you know, let me use the language of the TUC. The legislation is the brainchild of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the anti-union ex-investment manager whose previous claim to fame was taking his nanny on the campaign trail. And they list some of the things that are now at risk as a consequence of Brexit, effectively. Holiday pay, this is for the entire workforce. Especially those not protected by trade unions, holiday pay, agency worker rights, data protection rights, protections of terms and conditions for workers whose employment is transferred to another employer, collective consultation with worker representatives when redundancies are proposed, protection of pregnant workers and rights to maternity and parental leave, protection of part-time and fixed-term workers, rights relating to working time, including rights to daily and weekly rests, maximum weekly working time, paid annual leave, measures to protect night workers, protection of workers' rights on the insolvency of their employer, and rights to a written statement of terms and conditions. These are hard-won rights that the TUC now fears are going to be abolished by legislation being pursued by the current government as a direct consequence of the Brexit you supported.
Well, they're a direct consequence of having this government.
You can't have one without the other. Well, it's this government plus Brexit. Take away Brexit, exactly. The government couldn't do this.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. And
I know.
It's a political decision that the government we have has made.
But you've handed them it's just like they're going to go and shoot your dog, but you've handed them the gun.
Not quite.
Yeah.
No, it's not quite like that,
well, it is,
James,
mate.
because if we'd voted for a different government, which I campaigned for, we wouldn't be making these changes, and a future government is free to make legislative changes that it wants and could enhance what we do, and can indeed nationalise public sector services, which you cannot do inside the European Union. You have to have liberalisation.
You have
and
to
competition.
you have to have competition for franchises and for routes. Although they're a lot closer in some European Union countries to nationalisation than we currently are here. Did you realise?
Well, they're liberalising all of the routes in France
This is
and
the
Spain
fourth,
and Germany right now.
Did you realise when you supported Brexit that a Conservative government would be able to do these things?
Well, any government could do those things.
Outside the European Union?
You have sovereign power to
outside the European Union?
Yeah, you have sovereign power to make those laws.
Yeah, so you did realise that you were
We were aware
jeopardising
of that,
potentially holiday pay, data protection rights, collective consultation, protection for pregnant workers, protection of part-time and fixed-term workers. I could go on. I did a minute ago. You can play the tape.
But all laws deriving from the European Union are then have the opportunity to be amended now.
But this is, and we'll get into this a bit because we didn't last time. This is the whole point from where I sit of the European Union. I spoke to Mick Whelan about this, and I think I came to a slightly better understanding. You prioritise the nationalisation of the railways above everything else.
Yeah, because it's
and that is why you support Brexit, even when these are the costs.
It's a constitutional matter. These are not constitutional matters. The government doesn't have to change them. So the competition in public services, including the future of our health service and other services that are currently in the public sector, will be at risk because of the Maastricht Treaty and other measures, because they are hardwired into the Constitution and you cannot get a derogation from them permanently. So it's our view that much of the Corbyn manifesto would not have been allowed and would have been subject to legal challenge from the EU.
It's your view.
It's our view,
there are plenty of people who argue with that.
Yeah, and I accept that. This is a democracy. We take a view. People say we're ardent Brexiteers. We're not. We were asked a question.
I didn't use that word.
No, but people do in general.
Okay.
Many of your callers
maybe
and tweeters will say that. We were asked a question by a government that was elected to have a referendum. Our view was that our view on public ownership was an important one based on our principles.
So your support for Brexit was built entirely upon its impact upon your industry and not the country?
Well, we do have a belief that the country should be able to set its own laws as well, and there are consequences to that. I take that argument.
And those consequences are the potential abolition of some of the things that would once... It's the TUC that are saying this.
The TUC has a different position to our union.
On this issue.
And that's legitimate.
Of course it is. But the Trades Unions Congress, with whom you have a lot in common, historically,
we will campaign,
are warning against the abolition of some of the hardest-won workers' rights in the history of civilization. And you are partly responsible, or your position on Brexit is partly responsible for the freedom that the Conservative government has to now abolish them.
And we will campaign against those changes
well,
with all of the other trade unions. And if they change, we will campaign for a new workers' rights bill under a future government, which we're being told is going to come through.
Does it still trump all the other cards then? If there was a referendum tomorrow to rejoin the European Union, would the RMT still encourage its members or still adopt the position of resisting that?
Well, we'd have to think about that. If that was what was on the balance sheet, we would consider the position on the balance sheet.
All right. It's 11:48.
Mick Lynch, the leader of the RMT, takes your calls on L.
Not covered.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:51 is the time. Brenda is in Belfast. Brenda, what would you like to ask the General Secretary of the RMT?
Good morning, Mick. It's an honour to get speaking with you.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask, we obviously here have always been politically aware because our lives basically depended upon it. It's always been frustrating. I've noticed generally that we have been very aware that the English public have not been so politically aware. Now that the infrastructures are collapsing and people are literally dying in corridors, people's income is being eaten away by inflation, and we're watching the society basically collapse. Do you feel that there actually is a new awakening and more of a consciousness of political systems within the English? Because if that's happening, it will give a lot of people a much more hope. And looking at the rising support for yourself, which is well deserved, and the striking workers, do you feel that there has been a change in the public consciousness?
Well, I hope there is, and part of what we're doing is trying to articulate some of the long-term problems. So things like housing, the consequences of selling off all the council houses is now coming home to roost 20 or 30 or 40 years into it. The degradation of working practices and the dilution of contracts of employment is really hitting home in some communities. In the north of England, you can't get secure work in many areas. People are on minimum wage, they're on 0 hours contracts. All of those things are political, and I know people keep saying the trade unions are all commies and this, that and the other, but you cannot ignore the long-term effects of government policy, which weren't really reversed by the period of the Blair-Brown government. Those workforce reforms, as they were called, freeing up the labour market, making it liberal, are really hitting home now. And it's my children and other people's, the next generations, who will be faced with a lifetime, I think, of insecure housing, insecure work. And I think it'll have very deep-seated psychological effects on people, and I think it already is. People are really stressed by the world of work these days, as well as being underpaid. So I hope that we can wake people up. And the only way that you can respond is through collective organisation. That means realising that the only way that you can rebalance society against the rich and the powerful, and I mean big companies and oligarchs and employers, is by organising collectively and thinking collectively sometimes, that you work through your ideas and say, what are the new things coming through? And we're seeing that. We've got a movement over here called ACORN, which is a renters' union, if you like, and it's mainly done by, I don't know, people under 35, under 40, who've faced 15 or 20 years of having to share their homes with strangers, and people don't want to live like that anymore. And some of those people are looking to the trade unions to help them to organise on these issues about access to mental health, access to housing, access to education and all the rest of it. So the unions have got to reach out a bit, I think, just from the world of work and into the communities and say, look, we're here to help, and we're here to help you articulate what you do and to organise yourselves in different mediums, not just, straightforward pay and conditions and disciplinary matters at work. They've got to be a bit bigger than that, which was the foundation of the Labour movement. The unions were around before the Labour Party and invented the Labour Party so they could have a say on legislation and law. And we need to do that again, I think, make a broader movement that's cultural, that is political, is cooperative in terms of distribution of goods and all that, and is political as well, and as well as being industrial. So I'm hoping it will lead to a revival. And I hope that, I go back to Ireland quite a lot, and I do get a bit of feedback, and hopefully it's growing over there as well.
Have you been pleasantly surprised? We talked about public support, and albeit that there's now a small majority opposed to rail action. Have you been pleasantly surprised by public reaction?
I do.
Because historically it hasn't been this warm, has it?
I do get a lot of positive statements. People come up to me when I'm going out for a drink occasionally, and people want selfies. I don't relish that. I don't know why the people would want a selfie with me, but we get some hostility. Of course we do. We get people saying you shouldn't do that, and you're a nutter and all the rest of it. But on balance, most people say you're doing a good job. Some people say, I don't agree with you, I don't like what you do, but I think you're doing a decent job, and it's about time we heard a different voice. And I think many people across the political spectrum are actually enjoying the debate, because it's not just professional politicians that are getting in on this debate. It's other voices from different parts of the community, and the trade unions are part of that, and we've got to play that role.
I'll read you this because Beth has asked me, she says, please read all this, so I will. When you ask people if they support the train strikes, ask the people who actually use the trains regularly, not just at Christmas or Easter. I travel a huge amount on the trains, and as a woman travelling alone, I thoroughly support Mick Lynch and the strikers. I've had to travel late at night, and the idea of driver-only trains as a woman travelling alone is terrifying. Making this all about pay is the way to deflect from all the other real issues about staffing levels and safety. Keep going, Mick. Many of us actual train users support you. Why? I mean, there's a bit of an answer there, or a lot of an answer there, but why are driver-only trains, of course she means, such a sticking point, because that was, by your account, that's what they stuck on the agreement you'd reached with rail companies that meant you could no longer go along with it.
Well, they know we're never going to support it, and nor has ASLEF. We don't support that mode of operation, and there are operational reasons for that. There's safety-critical workers, and there's trap and drag incidents, and there's when trains crash or get derailed, you need a second person there to handle the emergency services, apply the rules and protect the passengers. And
if I say the last time that happened was in 1843 or something.
Well, it wasn't.
No, I know. But
trap and drags happen all the time. We had a major incident last year at Stonehaven where 3 people were killed. The driver was killed, and there were 2 guards on that train, one travelling to go to work, who took care of that incident and protected the passengers and blocked the line. So there are operational duties, but as important, there's accessibility. So trains and public services are meant to be accessible for all people, no matter what their impairments. And guards and station staff are part of that. But it's whether you want a dehumanised railway that's just there to clinically deliver that service at a profit, or whether you want a human railway that looks out for its passengers, is warm. I mean, warm in the sense of a warm environment, a welcome environment that's can do something about antisocial behaviour and can make women and other travellers comfortable. Not just women, there's plenty of men who feel vulnerable at night. But everybody can know there's a place of safety they can go where the guard will be there and look after them, has got access to the emergency services, but also the railway operators who can sort some of this stuff out very quickly.
A quick word also on the same subject. Julian Suffolk talks about elderly and disabled passengers as well, of course. Yeah,
they want to strip out all the ticket offices. The proposals we've got is to close every ticket office in Britain, and that means visitors to our country who might want help, people who can't use online apps, people with physical and vision impairments won't get the assistance. Now, we understand that new technologies come in, that apps and digital travel will be there, but that doesn't mean you strip away every facility. So we want to get an agreement on these changes and develop them rather than have them imposed on top of us and on top of the public.
We'll conclude with a couple of comments. This one from Joe Henshaw says, I like Mick Lynch, I fully support the action. However, on Brexit, his continued failure to call it out for the disaster it was sadly seems to be typical of so many whose personality simply doesn't allow them to face up to and admit their mistakes.
Well, I don't think it's been perfect, James, so I accept that.
Hang on. In his case, the potential impact on all trade unions through reforms may well come back to bite him and all workers very hard.
I know that.
Okay.
So I'm not impervious to it.
And on a different note, David Lumley has been in touch to say, hi James, as an ex-classmate of Michael's, could you please tell him how proud I am of the stand he's making for working people? Keep up the fight.
Oh, thank you. I remember him. He's near me on the register, Lumley.
Of course he would be. Lumley Lynch. Or Lynch. No, Lumley Lynch.
Yeah.
Mick Lynch, General Secretary of the RMT, many thanks indeed. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's 12 noon.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at midday. The General Secretary of the RMT has members are locked into their continued strike action because the government is refusing to negotiate. The RMT is in the middle of 4 days of walkouts this week as part of their long